On August the 19th of 2022, the trumpet world lost a shining star with the passing of Dan Miller. Now, everything about Dan was larger than life. He was a big guy with a big smile and a huge heart. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of jazz trumpet that he was always willing to share with anyone who asked. As a player, Dan had a massive sound that could fill up a room. Every note Dan played oozed with his passion for life and for music. But perhaps one of his greatest attributes was his skill as a teacher and his caring as a mentor to young players. Now, unfortunately, I never had a chance to get together with Dan. We tried several times to make a hang happen, but he had so much going on that we could never seem to find the right time. But through the many friends that Dan had and the friends that we shared, I felt I already knew him. And because of all the recordings of Dan that I've listened to, I certainly was touched by his playing. And so I felt it was only fitting to do this tribute to a man who brightened the lives of so many trumpet players, both directly and indirectly. So let's start with my conversation with Brad Goode about Dan and his lifelong passion for jazz.
I was living in Chicago in the mid 1980s. I had gone away to college at the University of Kentucky and come back. And I started my master's degree in bass at DePaul University. And I had a teaching assistant position there. And I met Dan because I was out playing quite a bit. And Dan's father, well, really both his parents, but his father especially, were very supportive of Dan's interest in becoming a jazz musician and would bring him to the clubs to hear music all the time. They were living in the suburbs of Chicago. And so Dan approached me, I think, at the Jazz Showcase and asked for lessons. And I told him, well, I'm not really a teacher. I'm a student. I'm just figuring stuff out myself. But he was so persistent and so insistent that he wanted to take lessons from me. I said, well, come over to my TA office at DePaul next week, and we'll see if we can work on some stuff. And when I met him there, I was just overwhelmed by his excitement and his enthusiasm and his love of jazz and his love of the trumpet. And we got right into it, and I was, sharing my record collection with him and talking about the great jazz trumpet players. And I remember him writing all these names down. And so we had a really nice lesson. Well, when he came back the second week, he told me he had been to the record store. He had bought all of these records I had showed him, and he was getting into it, and he was even trying to play some of the stuff. And he had a very, I had recommended that he listen to Fats Navarro, which in the end, became one of his favorite players, I think, for the rest of his life. But I remember him coming back one of those early lessons and saying, well, Brad, what is it exactly that you like about Fats Navarro? And, the answer to that question was hours long. And I had a book of transcriptions of David Baker, Fats Navarro transcription book. And I started, kind of showing him how Fats's lines were constructed and what kind of choices he was making and talking about his technique and all this. And I really felt like I was, I was talking to somebody who totally got it. It was just like everything I said, he's like, yep, I get that. I see it. I understand it. And he was just, 16 years old. So we had great lessons. He'd come every week for a couple of years, and we'd just go, 2-3 hours every time I saw him. And then I just kind of never heard from him again. I lost track of him. I knew he went off to college somewhere. I didn't know where. Turns out he went to North Texas, of course. Um, but 6 or 7 years later, maybe not even that long, he showed up one night at the Green Mill with basically the whole Harry Connick Jr. band, and Harry's band was so popular at that time that they had done. Well, Harry had done the When Harry Met Sally soundtrack, and he was huge, and he was able to book that band for extended runs at the Chicago Theater. So I think they would come to the Chicago Theater for like 2 weeks, and sell it out. And so after that first night, when he brought the whole band, I met that whole crew, great people, Roger Ingram and Leroy Jones and Brad Lely and Russell Malone and all, Jerry Weldon, all those great players that were in the band. Well, then every other night that they were there, they would come to wherever the jam or the gig was and kind of take over and turn it into a a big jam session. And then every time they came to town, uh, I would hang out with the whole band, and that's kind of where I reconnected with Dan. And I didn't even know he had, become a successful player until he walked in there. I wasn't paying attention, I guess. But after that, we kept in touch over all the years, and especially in these last 10 or so years, Dan had moved to Florida to take care of his mother, and established a great um, circuit and career down there. And my mother also lives nearby in Florida. So every time I would go down to visit my mother, I would usually see my mother during the day and hang out with Dan at night and catch up and do a lot of jamming, a lot of playing, a lot of talking, and just did that last month. Um, spent a few evenings going out to dinner with Dan, and even one of the nights that I was there, he put together like a little trumpet hang of notable trumpet players who were living in the area who I had never met, just so that I could meet these guys, which was just like him, always wanting to hang out with trumpet players and talk trumpet and talk jazz and have everybody be together. And um, just miss him tremendously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like everyone I've talked to about Dan over the years, um, the thing that comes out is, besides the fact that he was just a phenomenal trumpet player, but that kind of insatiable love for all things trumpet, not just the playing of the horn, but the history. And he was such an influential figure for anybody who had the opportunity to sit and talk with him, because it seemed like he always wanted to share his passion. It was like this infectious nature of the passion that he had to become a better player and to see the level of jazz go up. So, I mean, for you as an educator, I'm sure that kind of helps you to feel like you've helped another generation, because your relationship with Dan, getting him started and to see him continue with that kind of tradition. With that passion that he had, uh, you know, how do you see that as being a critical component of the things that he was able to accomplish as a player?
I think it was very critical. And it's funny because and thank you for saying that. I am very rewarded when I see students get the bug and carry the torch, and certainly with Dan, I always was very, very excited to see what he was doing. But I think that when I was working with Dan when he was a high school kid, I thought, the way to get you into this is to immerse you in the study of the lineage of the great jazz trumpet recording artists, and I think in my own music, in my own philosophy, and in my own teaching, I've gone other directions. I'm not as into that way of teaching anymore, but Dan became like the guy, you know, to to speak for and research and write about, write essays. He had this wonderful website where he had essays on the players that people might not know about, and I made all my students go to his website all the time. You know, I would tell them, "Oh, you ever never heard Freddie Webster? Well, here, check this out." And I'd send them the link to Dan's website, and Dan would tell the whole life story and have a discography, and Dan had all this information in his memory. He could sit and tell you, you know, who was on what recording session, what date it was recorded, why so and so was there. You know, he was such a crazy nut for the history of jazz and recordings, and a record collector, and so especially about jazz trumpet players, wanting to hear every note. You know, if he found out there was some recording he'd never heard, he would need to have it immediately, study it, added to his knowledge base, you know, just devouring that music. And the way he shared that with his students, and I would see like every week on social media, he would post a list of all of the recordings he had played for his jazz trumpet master class at Central Florida, where he was teaching. And then I would look at that and say, huh, I don't know that one. I would go check that one out. So I was learning from him, you know, by following him on social media all the time, for sure. You know, shared it with everybody, that passion.
Yeah, well, you know, and like you said, you can have divergent paths at some point, and you know, in terms of the way you're approaching, you know, your teaching perspective and what's important to you, and it is important to have. We have to have those historians. You know, there has to be somebody to kind of keep the keeper of the knowledge, and that's a base that I think that allows us, for people who are a little more forward thinking. It allows them to have that foundation to work off of, and you kind of get to a point where maybe you're beyond that, but you know the up and coming players still need to refer back to that information at some point. So it's in many ways that is a great loss of having that repository of knowledge about the history of jazz. But I mean, as a player. You know, I always loved this playing because you know he can cover all the bases, and as a player who's very similar to that, of being able you know to have, you know, outstanding improvisational chops, outstanding lead chops, that sort of stuff. You know, when you look at Dan's playing and the progression, especially having seen him, you know, when he first was bit by the bug, like what do you see as kind of like, if you had to say this encapsulated the style of Dan Miller, or the contribution that he made as a player, what would you say that would be?
Well, I think he was very focused on beauty, and he played just a fantastic ballads. I mean, so many times over the last several years, you know, go to hear him in Florida, or we would do things together out here in Colorado, and I would always say, you know, play another ballad, because just I love to hear him play ballads, and he had such a lyrical, beautiful way of playing in a kind of a classic sense. And to me, Dan, you know, you go to hear Dan play a gig, and 90% of the night he'd play with the cup mute, with the red and white, you know, stone line cup mute, and he just owned it. You know, he just owned that cup mute sound, and nobody plays cup mute anymore. You know, I mean, nobody. I never play a cup mute. I can't think of any jazz players who love the cup mute. And he made that sound so clear and so fat and so beautiful. And you know, he kind of carried that real bebop, hard bop tradition in through its most lyrical aspects. You know, he loved Fats Navarro, obviously. Freddie Webster was one of his obsessions. Um, Miles, Kenny Dorham, all of these lyrical bebop players, and I think for me, he represented maintaining and extending that tradition, and making that, putting that out in the air for the rest of us to enjoy in real life. You know, that's I think what sticks in my mind about Dan's music.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's an interesting perspective, for you, having gone from being a mentor to him in his early stages of development, and maintaining that friendship and that relationship over the years. I know that from people that I have learned things from, there's this interesting point where it goes from being solely the teacher to sometimes being the student from the teacher, that you get influenced by what they're doing or thinking. So can you think of anything that you particularly learned from Dan?
Yeah, I think it's what you and I were talking about, to not forget the tradition, and not forget that young people may not on their own stumble onto the right things, and that sharing the things that you think are important from that history of recordings with each new excited young trumpet player is a kind of a communal duty, to pay that forward. And I think he reminded me of that a lot.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Every episode of The Hang, the last question I ask in our rapid fire round is, what do you want your legacy to be? And I think sometimes we don't think about our own mortality. It's something that most people really never stop and think about. And now we're in a position where we've lost someone that is has been such a vital part of our community at such a young age, and it still had so much more to give, but he still has left a legacy. So if you had to think about what do you see the legacy that Dan Miller has left the trumpet world?
Well, I think it's two things. I think he's left the legacy of his wonderful performances, and you can somebody brought it to my attention this week that Dan had never made a leader album. And I first of all, my brain hurt. I said, no, that can't be true. But apparently it is. And I think that's a shame. I know he's made some wonderful records, and particularly with the group called the Jazz Professors, his fellow faculty members at Central Florida recently. But I think about those great videos that we all watch of Dan playing with Harry Connick or with Maynard Ferguson, or that we have that. But more importantly, I think Dan's legacy lives on in the many students that he touched, and the people he inspired, and the love for jazz, and the love for the art of the jazz trumpet as a very important and specific subset of jazz. That his enthusiasm for that, and his willingness to know everything he could possibly know about it, just bubbled over, and he shared it with everyone he could. And so there's so many young players, and not just trumpet players, but I know when times I would play with him in Florida, he would have former students coming by to sit in on all the different instruments. So he touched a lot of lives through his teaching, and he was a great teacher.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's always sad to lose someone that you know and that has impacted you. But yeah, like I said, with Dan, I even though I didn't know him, I felt like I knew him, and and I want to do my part to help to maintain his legacy, which is that love for jazz trumpet, and to and the love for helping other people to grow and to experience things that maybe they haven't experienced. So I certainly appreciate you taking time to talk with us about this and sharing, and your thoughts and your experiences. And do you have any last parting words that you'd like to share?
Well, appreciate the people in your life while you're here and while they're here. And when you talk to Dan, whether it was in person or on the phone, he would always tell you he loved you. And how many of us say that in our everyday conversations to our friends? And so I'm happy for that. Last time I saw him and his girlfriend Judy just last month. Big hugs and lots of I love yous, and that's important. We need to let each other know, because anything can happen to any of us at any minute, and you want to appreciate it. So, somebody said, is there such a thing as a jazz heaven? And a friend of mine said, well, what if this is jazz heaven? what if you're in it right now? Why don't you appreciate the hang and the live jazz that's going on around you every day? And sometimes I think, wow, it probably doesn't get any better than this. When it's really happening. So
yeah,
I think Dan felt that a lot. He did.
Yeah. Well, it came through. It came through in his playing, came through his teaching, and yeah, I just really appreciate you taking time, because I know how much Dan meant to you, and I know this is a emotional time for you as well. So
yeah,
thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you for taking the time to honor our friend. Yeah,
the least I can do. Dan was passionate about so much more than just trumpet playing. In fact, according to my next guest, Kenny Rampton, when Dan was interested in something, he was all in. Kenny and Dan spent years playing together in New York, and they became like brothers. So let's listen to what Kenny has to say about Dan as a player and as a person.
I heard about Dan Miller before I ever met him. We had a lot of mutual friends. He went to North Texas State. I went to UNLV and then the Berklee College of Music. Dan was a couple years younger than me. I just turned 55. He was 53. We had a lot of mutual friends, and I heard about him from my friends. Heard about what a great trumpet player he was, what a great guy he was. And then I heard he was moving to New York, and and I was excited to meet him. And we ended up on a gig together, playing with Wynton Marsalis, doing the series of videos called Marsalis on Music. And I might be wrong, but I think that's when we first met. But Dan was one of those guys, you meet a few people like this in your life. The second you meet them, they're like your best friend, and you've known them forever. And that's how it felt. That's how it felt with Dan from the very beginning. The moment I met him, I felt like I've known him forever, and we were best friends. He was just the nicest person. And I think he probably made everybody feel like they were his best friend. He was just that kind of guy. He he was a big guy. He had a huge sound, and his heart was bigger than both combined, man. He was like the nicest person. You, it's gonna be tough to get through, man.
Well, that's okay, man. You know, it's
He
like,
was-
you know, when you meet somebody like that, where there's just their entire essence just breathes, you know, breathes this air of love and caring and connection. You know, it's to find those people. It's once in a lifetime, and when we lose them, I know it certainly makes it that much harder for us to deal with.
yeah, I mean, it's words really can't express, man. I know that's a phrase used too often, but it's so true. And uh, Dan was family, man. He was a brilliant cat. He knew more about trumpet and jazz trumpet players than anybody that I know, period. And I know a lot of great players. I know a lot of great people. Dan knew more than anybody I've ever met. He was just, I don't know if he had a photogenic memory or what, but he was like a walking encyclopedia when it came to jazz trumpet. You know, he loved to share his knowledge. You know, I remember years ago, we were hanging out and this Clifford Brown bootleg surfaced. And only a handful of people had it at that time. And Dan got a hold of it. And he shared it with me. And it was just the beginning days of like being able to print CDs on your own and that kind of stuff. It was, you know, it was a while ago. And we decided to pitch fix it because it was a little bit sharp. So we brought, you know, we got the equipment and Dan and I, we pitch fixed it. And then we started printing CDs and just handing them out through the New York trumpet community. Every trumpet player that we would see, you know, me or Dan would like hand out one of these Clifford Brown bootlegs because people needed to hear this. Maybe it wasn't the right thing to do, you know, given the Clifford Brown estate and, you know, to give out recordings of Clifford, you know, without anybody's approval. But we didn't even think, we were kids. We didn't even think about that kind of stuff. We're like, man, this is some undiscovered Clifford Brown that everybody needs to hear and study, you know? And so that's what we did, you know, and that was Dan. He shared his knowledge, shared his passion for music, for trumpet, for jazz trumpet specifically with everybody he could who wanted to hear it. And that's what made him stand out as a person, made him stand out as a trumpet player and as an educator. Great educator, as is his brother Dave, wonderful trombone player. You know, they come from great parents. You know, Big J and their mom Virginia. Big J passed away recently, not too long ago. And you know, here's another testament to Dan's heart. Dan was living in New York. He lived over on in Brooklyn. There was a Royal Video store on the bottom floor, and he and his brother Dave lived above it. And a lot of cats went through that apartment or that building. Greg Gisbert, Roger Ingram, a lot of great players went through living there. And but it was Dan and Dave's spot, you know, and above the Royal Video, 6th Avenue and Flatbush in Brooklyn. We used to hang out there every night. You know, after our gigs finished, I didn't live far from there, so I was hanging out with Dan and Dave, and we were doing our thing and listening to music and watching movies. Dan was an aficionado on everything he did, man. You want to talk to him about movies, you know, when Quentin Tarantino was first coming out, and Dan's like, oh, he's nothing, man. He got all of his stuff from John Woo, and he had a collection of all of John Woo's movies out of Hong Kong, and showed me scenes where Quentin Tarantino had actually directly ripped off John Woo movies. And you know, we would hang out till the sun came up just about every night, man. We were super tight. But Dan was working in New York. He was doing the same gigs I was doing. He was, you know, we were both, you know, playing with, back then it was called the Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra with Wynton Marsalis. We were in the mix of players before it became a set gig, you know, and, you know, including that mix were cats like John Faddis, Lou Soloff, Roger Ingram, Russell Gunn, Marcus Printup, of course, Ryan Kaiser were both in the mix before Wynton settled into a full-time position for everybody. Dan was in that mix. And Dan was working with the best of the best, man. As you know, he was with Harry Connick. He tried to get me on Harry's gig at one point. Ended up not happening. But I did end up subbing with Harry's band at one point, you know, for his TV show. But, you know, regardless, Dan was one of the best trumpet players in New York, period. He played great jazz. He played phenomenal lead. He was the first great lead trumpet player I'd ever played with regularly in New York. And through playing with Dan, I played second trumpet in a trumpet section that Jim Rotundi was in, and Steve Wiseman was in that section. Great trumpet players went through that section. But that's when I really fell in love with playing in a trumpet section and understanding roles, you know, what it meant to play second trumpet to a great lead trumpet player. And that great lead trumpet player is Dan Miller, you know, and it gave me a deep passion for section playing with Dan. It's because of Dan, you know. He was a dear friend, man, but he was working with everybody. And then, excuse me, both of his parents got sick, and they're down in Florida. His dad had, what do they call it, a tracheotomy, where he couldn't speak. He had like the thing in his neck, and they were getting phone calls every day, you know, from insurance companies and hospitals and this and that, and getting what Dan described to me as like a phone book size of bills from doctors and all that. And his mom was having health problems as well. I think she had cancer at the time, which I think she may have overcome. His mom's still around, still with us. But it was more than she could really handle to go through all those bills and to take care of Big J, you know. And so Dan left New York and he moved down to Florida to take care of his folks.
Yeah.
How many people would do that?
Yeah.
You know, that's the kind of heart he had, man. He left everybody, left his friends, left his career, you know, and moved down to Florida to be with his folks. He moved in with them to take care of them. And then, you know, he got down there and he created his own scene. You know, he started playing, you know, a steady, I think he had like a 6 or 7 night a week gig, the quintet. He started teaching a lot. He created a scene there that has been thriving. And now he's, you know, in the last couple of years, he took a teaching position with the university down there, and he's been doing great. And he's teaching some of the finest young trumpet players I've ever heard, man. This young cat, Nathaniel from down there, man, he's on the highest professional level already. And I think he's a junior in high school, just about to start his senior year. This kid can play, and he's a Dan Miller student. You know, Dan is a great educator with a heart of gold, man. And, man, I just can't believe he's gone.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's rare to find a person that's got that level of, I mean, just the chops, you know, being a great player, then being a great historian, and being a great educator, and being a great guy. You know, it's hard to find anybody that checks all those boxes. So, you know, the impact that his life has made, definitely, you know, it's helped to move the world of trumpet up, you know, a space. But I think more importantly, it made the world a better place. I mean, because everybody I've talked to about Dan, you know, that yes, they appreciate him as a player, but the thing that always comes back to is that he is just a hell of a nice guy. So, you know, with working with him and knowing him both, you know, professionally and, you know, off the stage, I mean, what do you see as like the biggest impact that he's had on you as a person?
Dan always got along with everybody. He had a way about him, man. I never saw him get into an argument with anybody all the time I knew him. But yet he always stood his ground. He never backed away from a discussion. But he would discuss things with people who had a different point of view. And he was so intelligent and so knowledgeable that the discussion would always lead to them saying, wow, you're right, thank you. You know, it wasn't an argument with, you know, between people who disagreed on something. It was, you know, it was a discussion, and he enlightened people to whatever the issue was, man. I mean, he was just a good person, man. He was just, you know, he lived life on his terms. But at the same time, he never backed away from a confrontation, because it was a chance for either him to learn something or him to be able to teach somebody something. And so it wasn't confrontational in the sense that it was an argument or a fight. It was like, let's discuss this, let's figure this out, let's, you know, let's learn from each other, kind of a vibe. That's kind of what he was like, you know. And you know, his passion for everything he did was so deep, man. You know, whether it was the trumpet or jazz music in general, or a good meal, movies, sports. He loved sports. He used to have a basketball pool at his apartment in Brooklyn, you know, and all the cats in town would, you know, it was an NCAA, you know, tournament. And we would all join it, and, you know, it wasn't much money. I actually won it twice. I think I'm one of two people who won it twice, at least last I heard. The other one was his dad, Big J. You know, we had fun, like going through, put everybody's sheets on the walls and scoring them. And he was so deep into it, so deep into basketball, you know, be it collegiate level or pros, you know, whatever he was into, he was into it 100%, man. He lived life on his own terms,
yeah.
You know, and was just the most beautiful cat you'd ever hope to meet. You know, so, I mean, how did he influence me? Like, just by example, being who he was inspiring to me. I mean, one thing that's really obvious is we found these plunger mutes, these toilet plungers at a hardware store in Brooklyn. And it was the best size we'd ever found. It was a little bit bigger, made the plunger play a little bit more in tune, and I'd never seen them anywhere else. And then we took a road trip up to Tanglewood, and we would always stop in, you know, whenever we're hanging out, we would stop in any hardware store we could to look for plungers, you know, for toilet plungers, find the best size possible. It was an obsession for both of us, and they had that same size in this store we stopped at on the road. So we bought a crate of them. We bought them all, and just like we did with the Clifford Brown video, we passed them out to every trumpet player in the community that we could find, you know. And that actually became the base for the plunger mute that Ed Hirschman and I put out. We actually 3D scanned one that I'd given to Winton, and it cracked. Winton couldn't use it anymore, so we 3D scanned that plunger that I'd found with Dan, you know. And then we started tweaking it and changing the shape and size and doing what we did to it to come out with the thing with, you know, that Ed and I came out with. But Dan was a part of that before it was a thing, you know. Now it's a thing, you know. But, you know, of course I sent one to Dan, you know, and, you know, but Dan impacted my life in so many ways, man. His passion for trumpet, his passion for section playing became a part of my DNA, you know, and I'm where I'm at in my career largely because of that, you know, because I have a deep passion for section playing. You know, I understand what it means to role play in a trumpet section, to play second trumpet. There are a lot of second trumpet players who are frustrated lead players who are jealous and mad that they're playing second trumpet. You know, I'm not like that. I love playing second trumpet. I love supporting a lead trumpet player. I love playing third and fourth trumpet too. I love being in a section and understanding the role playing. I have a deep passion for section playing, and that's largely because of Dan Miller, man, because he was such a great lead trumpet player. That's one thing that to me is a little bit of a travesty, is that when he went down to Florida, he wasn't playing a lot of lead trumpet that I'm aware of. He was mostly playing jazz, mostly small group jazz, which was like his deepest passion, you know. But he was such a phenomenal lead trumpet player. You know, there's nobody better than Dan Miller as a lead trumpet player. There are a lot of guys who are great, a lot of guys who are in that realm for sure, but nobody better. You know, Dan, he had such a huge, glorious tone, man. You know, he was always swinging, always. I never heard him play a phrase that wasn't swinging, ever. You know, he was so in tune with the spirit of the music. He played with so much spirit, so much passion at all times. I never heard him play a note that didn't have feeling in it, ever. You know, he played with this beautiful vibrato. He loved to play in the cup mute, you know, and even in the cup mute, he had this gigantic tone. It was unbelievable, man. I never heard anybody with a sound like his. And when he opened up and didn't use a cup mute, man, it was incredible. So, I mean, it's a shame that he didn't play more lead trumpet when he went down to Florida, but he followed his passion. He lived life on his terms. He was great at it, but he loved playing small group. He loved playing jazz. And that's what he dedicated his time to. That and teaching. He loved teaching. He loved bragging on his kids, man. I talked to him about Nathaniel after he came out and played at the Essentially Ellington Festival when I met him. And he told me he was Dan Miller's student. I was like, oh, man, I gave him a big hug and said, your family. You know, and I called Dan that day and talked to him about him, you know, and his other students, man. And, you know, Dan loved teaching, you know, everything he did 100%. I hate saying 110% or 1,000% because that's all nonsense. But, you know, he did 100%, absolutely, everything that he did. And it was a life well lived.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things I always ask, you know, and I asked you when you were on the hang, you always ask about what you want your legacy to be. And, you know, in this case, as we're looking back at the life of Dan, what do you see his legacy as his major contribution to the world of trumpet as being?
All those things, man, his passion, his sound, his students, you know, obviously his students are a continuation of him. So that's his legacy, and every one of their students is part of his legacy. Dan Miller will live forever through his students and through his family, you know, and that's something else I want to talk about a little bit is his family. You know, Dan and his brother Dave, both phenomenal musicians. Dave is a great trombone player. He's played with you name it. He was with Harry Connick. I think he's teaching at where's he, Rutgers now? He's teaching, and like Dan, he's got a deep passion for education, you know, and for playing. He's a wonderful trombone player. He loves Curtis Fuller. He's coming right out of Curtis, I think, and he's, like Dan, one of the nicest people you ever hope to meet. Now Dave has a daughter who plays trumpet, and she's in college, and her hero is her Uncle Dan. I think she posted on Facebook, called him Unky Dan. And, you know, Dan taught her, worked with her, and was her uncle, you know, and she's going to be part of Dan's legacy, you know. She is part of Dan's legacy. She's a terrific young trumpet player. I haven't played with her in person yet, but I've checked out videos of her playing, and she can play, man. You know, Dan's family and his girlfriend, Judy, and, you know, his mom is still here, Virginia. I mean, they're just all wonderful, beautiful people. And they're all an extension of Dan, and they're all part of his legacy, and they're all going through a tough time.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's any loss is difficult, but when someone is that that deep, that giving, that connected with people, yeah, it feels, sometimes it feels like the the rug's been pulled out from beneath you, because you know,
Yeah.
such a major part of your life. And you know, I think that the greatest thing is not just the outpouring of love and support that I've been seeing from people, and I'm trying to be a part of this as well. But it's the fact that so many people they just say, Dan was just always there. It wasn't like he wasn't one of those fair weather friends, or that he was always there, and you knew how he felt about you, and you knew how you felt for him, and there was never any kind of ambiguity. Everything was just very, very crystal clear, and that he had that love for so much, and it was infectious. And so I know how much he meant to you, and obviously as a player and as a friend. But if there's like one thing, we talked about that legacy concept, but if there's one thing that we could do as people who weren't directly in his life, if there's one thing that we could do to honor what he was trying to accomplish in his life, what do you think that one thing would be?
To live every aspect of your life with full integrity at all times.
That's a tall order,
That's who he was.
Yeah. It's so simple, but it's so hard to do.
That's who he was. I was just looking back, my last text message with him was a couple weeks ago. There was a recording that somebody, the school, the university where he teaches, was helping to put together with an Italian artist. And Dan wasn't able to do it because he was taking a vacation with Judy. They went to New Orleans. They did that, I think, every year for a number of years. And so Dan recommended me to do this recording. Well, I happened to be in Las Vegas at the time, spending time with my mom and my son and family, and we had a lot of things we had to do, and I worked with my nonprofit organization out there, and my plate was just too full to be able to do it. So I sent Dan a text and said, I'm not going to be able to do this, man, but thank you for thinking of me. And he wrote back, I'm always thinking of you.
Yeah.
And I just wrote back, likewise, my brother, something like that. But that was my last message from Dan.
Yeah. And I'm sure that you're always going to be thinking about him going forward too. And wherever.
Yeah, as is anybody who knew him. Yeah. I had a long conversation today with Jim Seeley about him. Jim is one of the baddest trumpet players I ever heard in my life. He, is from Kansas City. He lives in New York now, and he's one of my best friends forever. And we just, we spoke, as soon as we both heard about Dan, we spoke on the phone, and we just spoke again today, and, spoke a lot about Dan, and, we used to all hang out in that apartment, man, above the Royal Video, 6th Avenue, Flatbush in Brooklyn. That was the hang spot. And it was a hang spot because it was Dan's home. That was Dan's apartment. Wherever Dan was, it was a hang, and people flocked to be around him. People wanted to be around him because he was just so cool, so much fun, and so giving. There was always going to be a good time. There was always going to be something to learn, something to grow from. It was, Dan was the best, man. And, when I heard about it, I texted Wynton, and somebody posted on Facebook a picture of Wynton and Dan from when we did the Marsalis on Music videos up in Tanglewood. And Wynton was showing Dan how to play. There's a high A flat where it starts closed plunger and it opens up. It's a long note. I think on, what's the Duke Ellington tune? The Train tune. Or the Happy Go Lucky Local, I think was the name of the tune. And Wynton was showing Dan how he wanted him to play it. And Frank Stewart took a picture of that. Of Wynton, he's fingering the A flat, and Wynton was playing at the time. He was playing the Husenberg red and white plunger. And it was a bunch of kids there. It was a video shoot, for education, teaching kids. And this one little kid sitting right in front of him had his ears covered like this. Dan loved that picture, man. He loved it. And I was there when it was taken, and somebody posted it, and so I sent that picture to Winton. You know, after I texted Winton and said, "Hey, man, I got some bad news," and I let him know. You know, and it's tough to tell somebody in a text that their friend died, but I did with Winton, and I said, "I know it's tough, man. I said, I know you loved him." And Winton texted back. He said, "Who didn't?"
Yeah.
And that's the truth, man.
Yeah.
Anybody who knew Dan felt the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that picture, I've seen it, and I love it. It's just, because it exudes so much personality, so much love and caring and humor, and the generational stuff that's going on in there. And I think it kind of, to me, it kind of encapsulates the spirit of Winton and of Dan, and the interplay. And that's just it's a rare convergence that occurred there. And
Dan's shirt he was wearing,
it was perfect. Yeah.
Life short, play hard, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And the first person who texted me to tell me about Dan was another friend of ours who came up in the ranks, and now he's musical director for Sesame Street. He plays trombone with Eddie Palmieri and the Mingus Big Band, and you name it. It was Joe Feidler. And Joe's one of my best friends as well. And Joe's the one who texted me about Dan. And Joe he used a phrase in a text when he told me that says it, man. He just says, Dan was universally loved.
Yeah. And and that is certainly something to aspire to, being that kind of person that, like you said, that you're able to stand your ground, but you're able to do it in a loving way, and just being completely authentic.
At all times, man. And Dan was universally loved, man. I never met anybody in my entire life that ever said a bad word about Dan Miller. Ever. He's just, everybody loved him.
Yeah.
He was a good dude, man.
Yeah.
He's missed. He's going to be missed. But he'll live on forever, man. I might play every solo I have for the rest of my life in a cup mute, just to in tribute to Dan. I remember he had this old beat up cup mute. We were hanging out back in the day in Brooklyn, and it was falling apart, man. The top part of it, the cone, whatever it's called, not the cone, but the cup.
Yeah.
Had come off. The center part of it was unglued and coming off and leaking everywhere and needed corks. But Dan loved the sound of that mute. It was an older Humes and Berg cup mute, and that was his favorite. And he couldn't find another one that quite matched that sound. So I'm like, Dan, let me try and fix it for you. So he let me. So I took it home, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just, got some glue, and I glued things together and patched up the holes and put some new corks on it. I think I epoxied corks onto it, but it worked, and it was sturdy, and it still had the sound. And Dan loved that cup mute. I don't know what cup, if he still had it, or not. It probably fell apart. Elmer's glue isn't the way to fix a mute, But I was talking to Dave about that today. I called Dave a little bit ago, talked to him. But man, gonna miss that dude.
Yeah.
I don't know that I'll play every solo I have in a cup mute, but whenever I do use a cup mute in a solo from now on, just know that that's a tribute to Dan Miller.
It's a tribute to Dan. I think we should just have a National Cup Mute Day.
Hell yeah.
Well, Kenny, I really appreciate you, talking about your relationship with Dan and sharing your insights. And I mean, I know it's not easy, but you know, I do believe it's also part of our personal healing process and being able to talk about stuff and let your emotions out. And you know, for people that are out there right now that are missing Dan, you know that you know we're all missing him at different levels, and you know, and even as we go into the stages of our lives where we do, you know, maybe you haven't lost anybody personally in your life that's close to, but if you're watching this episode and you know when you're dealing with loss, that understand that you know, we all feel grief, we all you know, process things differently, but one of the best things you can do is just to honor the memory of the person by sharing the importance that they had in your life, because that's the best tribute you can ever give anybody, is just you know, being honest about how you felt.
Yeah, man. And thank you for doing this, Jose. This is beautiful. I mean, and this is a testament to Dan Miller, to who he was. You didn't know him personally. You didn't get to hang with him like many of us did. And the fact that he's impacted your life enough for you to want to do this says a lot about him and about you. So thank you for doing this, man.
Oh man, you know, I like you and like Dan, you know, I love trumpet, and I love, you know, sharing with people and trying to make the world a little better place, and introducing them to different things. So you know, what I hope is that, you know, for the people that did know Dan, that you know, they feel the sense of connection that you know, as we all grieve through this together. And for people who don't know Dan, that you know, that they go back and they start, you know, checking out the stuff that he's done, you know, and support his students as they're coming up the ranks and trying to you know, honor his tradition. So you know, there's so much that we can do to continue to honor Dan, even though he's no longer with us. But I mean, but he's always going to be with us. I think that's the biggest point. He's always going to be with us, you know.
Yeah.
So
Right on.
all right, man. Well, I appreciate you and love you, man. And you know, to me, you're one of those cats too, you know.
Thank you, brother. Thank you, man.
Dan left a legacy in his playing, but also in the young lives that he touched. One notable student of Dan's is Nathaniel Wiliford. While he's still in high school, Nathaniel has already caught the attention of the trumpet world. And just like Dan, it's not all about his playing. Nathaniel's an old soul with an understanding of trumpet that's well beyond his years, but he also has a gentle and open heart, much like his mentor. So let's hear from Nathaniel on the impact Dan made on him and how he intends to keep Dan's legacy alive.
You know, one thing I'll preface all of this is with saying is that this is something that's so common with, you know, that there's just been an outpouring of love and support for Dan. And so many people have the same thing to say about, you know, even if they only met him once or twice or spoke to him once or twice, ran into him here or there, everyone can say that they feel like they've known him forever, you know. So this past week, you know, I've been looking back and reminiscing, and if you boil it down, like I've known Dan only close to 3 years now, you know, but our relationship, like I there's no better way than to say that it feels like I've known him since the very beginning, you know. And he always treated me as such. He was always there for me as if he had just been there for me from square one. I met Dan in January of 2020, and he was the clinician for the all county jazz band that I was in, and it was a beautiful experience. And I'm always embarrassed to say this now because of the monster that he is and how close we were. But when I went into that experience, I didn't know who he was. And it's funny because I really should have known who he was, because, you know, I've checked out a lot of the Lincoln Center recordings that he's on, of a lot of the Harry Connick Jr. stuff that he was on. But I didn't know him, you know. I didn't know who he was. And our first rehearsal came around, and it was just like the best experience, the best learning experience. And he would play for us because, those are all kind of rehearsals. It's not just about the charts that we're playing. Dan really brought this further understanding of music. We worked through a lot of his teachings of Barry Harris and David Baker. And I remember the first like crazy impression that I had of Dan was his sound when I heard him play. And it was in a high school auditorium, but it was a pretty nice one, it was kind of built for that jazz band setting. So I got to hear him play, and I was just like, whoa. This was my freshman year of high school, so I had never heard a trumpet sound in person like that. It was my first time where I was just like engulfed in his sound. It was, to this day, honestly, probably the biggest trumpet sound that I've heard live. It was just like the fattest, roundest, most gorgeous tone. And right away, I could just tell that he was somebody I really liked. After, like, when we would have breaks during rehearsal, I was always running up to my friends. I was like, yo, this stuff is hip. We were talking about the bebop lines, and I'd be like, yo, check this thing that I'm coming out with, what he just told me about. And I was just super excited about all this stuff. So immediately, like, right after that day, I started showing up to the rehearsals early every morning so I could be there. And he and I would just talk every morning before rehearsal. It was only a couple days, but we would geek out about gear. I would tell him what I was playing on, this and that, and he would be like, oh yeah, you should check this out. And that kind of just started the whole relationship of, him just letting me know what was up, what to look out for, what I should be doing. And, you know, every morning he would ask me like, hey man, how you feeling? You okay? Like it was always, he always checked in on me as a person before anything else. And all of our lessons, whenever we would get into a lesson, he'd be like, how are you? He would ask about my family. Majority of the time that I was studying with him, I was living with my grandma, my great grandma. I was taking care of my great grandma while my grandma went to work. And every lesson I would get on, how's your grandma? He was always checking in about how things are. And it was just a very personable, a caring relationship that made sure you were okay before anything else. So through that all kind of experience, it was real fun. That was we played this old bassy tune, and it was the first time that I ever like had to role play Snooky Young. He gave me this feature that was in this old tune, Who Me, and I had to get some stuff together. He was like, yeah. One thing, when I was recently on tour with NYO, one of the piano players in the group, his name is Brandon Goldberg. He was a student of Dan's for longer than me. He knew Dan for a long time. And this is before Dan passed, but we used to just talk about him all the time. And I remember one thing that I always remember is when he used to count the band off, the band in, like it was real intense. 1, 2, home, 2, it was real. Dan was an intense guy. And if you look at any of the videos of him playing, you can tell that he's fully devoted every single time. He's just all in. So yeah, the all kind of stuff went by, and after I got to talk with him, and that's when he told me first, he was like, I would love to teach you. He gave me his business card, and I still have it. I carry it around in my wallet every day. And he was like, yeah, let's get together at some point. He was, at that point, he was still artist in residence at UCF. And then the following year, he became faculty officially. But I was like, yeah. And then a couple months went by, my fault that I didn't reach out. And then COVID happened. I went home in March of 2020. And literally like 2 weeks in, Dan reached out to me. And he was like, hey, brother, how you feeling? You all right? Checked in on me. And then he was like, let's start getting together once a week. And that's when things really started, we spent, it's funny, like I can't describe it in any other way than like Dan was truly the best teacher that anybody could ask for. there was certain material that like I couldn't grasp at first, and it wasn't just like him hammering out until you get it, you know. It was like one of the ways that he taught, which I loved, was like using the things that you already know and then having you figure it out. You know, you can dig deep, and he's not just going to give you everything. And there was so much stuff. You know, I've been listening to jazz pretty seriously for a long time. Even at that point, I had already, you know, I've been listening to a lot of stuff. So a lot of the stuff that he did was like to explain a lot of the stuff that I'm used to hearing, you know. And that was the coolest thing, because then I finally felt like I had some understanding or some kind of knowledge on all the stuff that it sounds familiar, you know, I'm used to hearing it all the time, but I never really knew why. And he went and explained why. And he would constantly tell me stories, you know, about a million different things, about his time with Maynard, about his time with Roger. He would tell me all these stories of being on Harry Connick's band with Roger, his stories with Bobby Shue. Dan Miller is the person that connected me with Bobby Shue. When I had my first lesson with Bobby, it was because of Dan. Dan was there in our lesson. We did a Zoom hang, and it was the three of us, you know. And that's another one of my highlights. That was a really good time, because you know we were talking about efficiency, and we talked about the science of the breath and things like that. But you know, Bobby would say something. You remember this, Dan? You know, and I just get to hear these past experiences come up. And same thing with Roger. When I had my lesson with Roger last year, that was Dan helped me. Like, you know, Dan spoke to Roger beforehand. Um, Whenever we had our lessons, it was the highlight of my week always, because I knew that I was going to learn something new. I knew I was going to learn some kind of new material. I knew that I was going to be able to talk about things other than music with Dan. You know, I was going to just get to relax. And I also knew that I was going to hear stories about some of the greatest musicians of all time, you know, stories about people on Lincoln Center Band with Wynton, Maynard Ferguson, Harry Connick Jr., you know, like the list goes on and on of like some of the best musicians that have ever been on this planet, you know. So it was just like this wealth of information every time that still felt so good. And one of the things that's been really hard for me this past week is, you know, I've been studying with Dan for a while, and I've been really fortunate this past year, really. A lot of beautiful things have happened, and I've been fortunate to have met a lot of great people, formed a lot of great relationships with some folks. And, you know, whenever something big would happen, Dan was always the first person I call. You know, I would call him up and talk to him about the whole experience, and he would be so excited for me. That was his whole thing. I'll never forget when I called him up after we won essentially Ellington. He had listened to some of the live, and he was like, "Yeah, it sounded beautiful. You and Daniel sounded beautiful." And he was like, "I'm so proud of you guys." And I told him when when I met Wynton Marsalis for the very first time, this was we were doing the award ceremony, and the first award I won was Outstanding Trumpet. And prior to this, you know, I had already talked to Kenny Rampton and Marcus Printup, and I had told them about Dan Miller. You know, we all had our conversations about him and stuff. They're like, "Oh yeah, I love him. You know, you got to tell him hi, all this stuff." So you know, word gets around quick and all this stuff. So Witten, I get called up for the Outstanding Trumpet, and I go on stage, and I shake Witten's hand and give him a hug, and he only told me two words. That first time that I met him, he had two words. He didn't say anything before that or after that. He looked at me dead in the eye, and he said, "Dan Miller." And that was it. You know, the first time meeting one of the, if not the greatest trumpet players, you know, of all time. All he told me was Dan Miller. You know, he knew, he understood, you know, what that meant, and obviously the kind of person that Dan was. And I called Dan up, and I shared some stuff, some other stuff that had happened at essentially Ellington, and he was just so ecstatic for me. He tell me that I can imagine no higher honor than to receive a compliment or recognition or developing a relationship with one of the greatest people. And he told me like I know it because I lived it too. You know, I'm so grateful for my relationship with Winton. And we just we talked for a while about that, you know, and that moment with Winton was like another eye-opening experience. Like I knew how great Dan was, and I knew how lucky I was to have him. But then that was like just like I don't even want to say the cherry on top. That was like the whole cake, you know. It was just like, damn, you know, these everybody knows.
Yeah.
And I would call Dan up. The last time I spoke with him was towards the end of my tour. I was on the bus, and I texted him the podcast. I sent him the podcast, and just said like, "Hey, Mr. Miller, I recorded this a couple weeks ago, and I talk a lot about my relationship with you and studying with you." So he called me up right away, like right as soon as I sent it to him, and he was like, "Hey, brother, yeah, I checked it out. You know, thank you. I really loved it." And then we just talked. He was like, you know, how's tour? He was checking up on me, how my chops feeling, how am I feeling getting through it, you know. And just to show Dan's like everlasting love for everybody around him. When school started back up last year, my junior year of high school, um, we had a brand new jazz director, and he's amazing. His name is Jason Anderson, incredible saxophonist, but one of the greatest directors. And you know, of course, I let him know that I was studying with Dan, and right away he was on the like, oh, okay, let's see what we can do with that. His son is a trumpet player who's now in 8th grade. He's a monster. I mean, his dad is a really great musician, you know, so he had a head start, but he's just the greatest. And then there's another young trumpet player at my school, Christina Doan. I want to say she's a freshman this year, and real hungry, you know, wants to learn. And at this point, Dan had also been teaching one of my friends, Daniel. He's in my grade, you know. So right away, my teacher started getting in the works, like to have more people at my school studying with him. So he had his son Xavier studying with him, Christina studying with him, and the last time I spoke with Dan, he was like, "Hey, you know, I've been working with one of these trumpet players at your school, Christina." He was telling me about, he was like, "Yeah, this, and that, you know, we had to change up her embouchure a little bit. She was playing on the red, and you know, we got some good stuff going, but you know, she's really great. Can you check in with her at school? Just make sure she's all right. Work with her, like." Whatever our conversation was, it was always about making sure that everybody was good, you know, and everybody was on the right path. Even the last time I spoke with him was about, you know, an up and coming musician at my school. The same thing, you know, he had been going over the teachings of Barry Harris and David Baker, and he also started telling her about the efficiency using the body, you know, and so of course, you know, now especially this past week, I've met with both of them, Christina and Xavier, a couple times a week, and I'm trying my best to pass on everything that Dan left me with. But I do have to say that the hardest thing for me with Dan passed is a lot of the stuff that we used to talk about that he was very excited for me for. You know, I would talk about college or this and this and that, and it just hurts to know that, you know, I'm not gonna get to give Dan a call, you know, when something happens or I meet somebody or I go somewhere, you know. He was always the first person that I wanted to update about something, you know. Hey, Mr. Miller. Yeah, I just want to let you know this and that. And he was like, beautiful brother. And sorry.
I mean,
And he used to always tell me, he said, at the end of messages and stuff whenever he spoke, he was like, keep swinging, brother. He would always say, keep swinging. Love you, brother. You know, he always checked in like that, you know. And it was just always this forward motion, that I hope you're okay and let's keep moving up. Let's keep moving forward and keep growing. We talked about so much stuff, and going back to when I was taking care of my grandma, he was also taking care of his mom at the same time. So like there was times in our lessons that we're not even talking about the trumpet. There was there would we would talk about, what it's like to be a caretaker because it's hard. There was also a time where March of last year I got my wisdom teeth removed, and Dan would check in with me every couple of days, text me, "How you feeling today, man?" And then we had a lesson that week. Obviously, I couldn't play. I was fresh out of surgery, and we just talked. Like he was willing to do a lesson of just an hour, almost an hour and a half, and he was just telling me stories, and telling like, "Hey, you got to be careful with this and that. Don't play too soon. It's all right. Your chops are gonna be there when you get back." It was just the best word I could use to describe Dan was love, and you felt it in everything that he said, everything he did. Whenever I asked him for something, he was always willing. This is a long time ago, a couple months ago, not a whole long time ago, when I was auditioning for this group NYO. I asked him to write me a letter of recommendation, and he sent it to me too, and like I cried, reading this letter of recommendation because it was so personal. It wasn't nothing that Dan did was generic. It was always genuine and honest to whoever he was doing that for. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of some of my recollections on Dan.
Well, it, obviously he was a monstrous player, but the thing that everyone that I've talked to uh, over the years that know that work with Dan or knew Dan in any capacity, it was exactly what you said. It was love. It was love and passion. He loved the trumpet, and he 100% into it. He loved jazz as an art form, and so really into it. He loved sports. He loved movies. He loved and whatever it was, he was all in.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest thing is he had a love for people, and um, and you could see that come through in everything that he did. When he played, you knew it was coming from his heart.
Yeah.
And like having talked to you and your experiences with him as a teacher, it's apparently apparent that he taught from the heart. And I think it's like we talked about in our hang that we did originally, the difference between a teacher and a mentor, and he definitely took that mentor role. And, he just, I think maybe the hardest part with losing somebody like that is that, they take so much space in our life that
Yeah.
when they're gone, there's just like this tremendous hole.
Yeah.
But the question then becomes, what do we do with that hole? What do we fill it with?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, with you, and I'm going to switch and talk about you for just a second. That the thing that I hear from the cats that have had a chance to, not only hear you play, but talk with you and things like that and interact with you, is they say, yeah, we can tell that this is Dan's student, not just because of the way he plays, but the way he is. You have some of those same attributes. You have a ferocious love for jazz and trumpet. You have a desire to be the best that you can be, but you also have that humility and that love and respect for yourself, the art, and other people. So you and your classmates, the people that were were with you and Dan, these past few years, you have an opportunity to fill the hole that he left by giving what he gave you to the world.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. That means a lot. I a lot of people have reached out to me since Dan passed away, because like even before we recorded the hang a couple of weeks ago, like I told everybody, everybody knew how much I loved Dan. So many people reached out to me, and it was hard, but it was also encouraging to hear that, in the same spirit of when Dan would tell me about Christina or Xavier at school, Marcus Printup and Kim at Warburton, all of these other people would tell me. Brad Goode reached out to me as well, that they would just say that Dan would just say how proud he was, and it made me feel a little bit like it'll be all right, because it was just that continuation of love, when Dan loved something, everybody knew about it, just like we're talking about with sports or this and that, and that just, it made me feel like I still had a piece of him around, It's a hard feeling to describe, but it kind of like brought a lot of stuff back, and made me think about a lot of the conversations we had and this and that, It's just, I don't know, it's been hard, but I feel so fortunate, to have had him in my life, to have had the relationship that we had, and I'm also so grateful to see this like outpouring of love for him, everybody has something to say about Dan, and it's always great, and it's always personal too, like there's like some, people saying that they feel like they've known him forever, but everybody has a personal experience with Dan when he sat down and was like one-on-one with them and focused on whatever it was with them, Dan was not the person that was just going to give you the same run-of-the-mill stuff, It was seriously like, all right, here's me and you. How can I help you become greater or become what it is that you want to become, I miss him a lot, man.
Yeah. Well, the the hard part is accepting, the fragility of life,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's hard to deal with even though loss is inevitable, it still hurts, and especially when someone has that much impact, and it's, what can we do to honor them, and even though he's no longer physically here with us, he's the impact that he's made on the world is going to continue, and the music that he's recorded, obviously that's still going to be inspiring trumpet players forever, and the students that he's produced, you guys, like you especially, your position now to take that torch and to carry it forward and take all of the good stuff that he left you, and then add your own experiences and add your own personal view on it, and make something new and great. So it's going to be a challenge, and but I don't know what anybody believes in terms of what happens to us after we die, but I do believe that whenever you have that need that you're always going to be able to talk to Dan.
Yeah.
You know, because he's going to, no matter what's happened, where he's at, I can guarantee you that he's always going to be in your heart. So all you got to do is just take that moment and just go deep in your heart, and he's going to be there. And what would Dan do? And you can ask that question.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's and I 100% can appreciate what you're going through, and that you're in a really interesting position. So I just really hope that you you can take the time to process, to grieve, to honor, to remember. And that's part of what I wanted to do with this, is to give some people an opportunity not only to give remembrance of him, but also a chance to really express what's going on in their hearts. And so that other people can get a better sense of who Dan was, and what he really meant to all of us trumpet players.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's deep, but so one of the questions that I ask you on our hang, and I always ask every guest, is about legacy. What you want your legacy to be. And with Dan now, while he's passed, his legacy is going to live on. So my question to you would be, what do you see his legacy as being? And then secondly, what do you feel like you're going to be able to do to help to make sure that legacy continues?
I think that Dan's legacy is one of I think what makes it so beautiful is that it's a legacy of who he was and how he loved, before it's a legacy of him as a musician. What he's leaving past with us is not just, oh yeah, he's a monster trumpet player. He played the horn so good. He played the shit out of the horn. It's more than just that. It's a lot more than that. Before that even enters the conversation, it's about, man, being around Dan was being around love. You'll never meet somebody as passionate and as intense as that. There was one time I went to UCF there was like, Sean Jones was there. He gave like a master class, and there was a concert at night. And then Dan gave like a miniature trumpet master class. And like, Dan was just intense all of the time. He talked about being dialed in. And it was very, Dan was on 100 all the time. Despite, Dan was super busy. Here in Florida, Dan was gigging like 5, 6, sometimes 7 days out of the week. Like, he was a busy dude. And despite all of that, he was always on 100 at all times. And one of the ways that he was on 100 was like caring for people, for caring about his students. I've got the chance to talk to a couple of his students, since he's passed. We reached out to each other, and it's the same thing. Like, when we think about Dan now, we just think about like sharing love and passion. It's one thing to be passionate, but I think it's a different thing, and I think it's very difficult to pass on passion, to instill a passion with others, because you can do something that inspires somebody, but to instill the love and passion for this music the way Dan did for me and a lot of other people, like, that's no easy feat. I've always loved this music, but Dan gave me a totally different and deeper connection to it and understanding of it, that just like poured gas all over the fire that was already lit. And I don't think very many people can do that, like, at least the way that Dan did. So I think Dan's legacy will be, or is, who we should all strive to be as a person first, and then as a musician, because he had all the chops in the world to back it up. I mean, Dan could play. There's no question about that. You know, he's by far one of the greatest. You know, the sound, his ideas, everything about it. You know, an amazing lead player. You know, just the list goes on and on about things that Dan could do. So for me, that's the thing that I think about when I think of Dan's legacy. Like, I hope, I wish to achieve some of that, or at least some kind of percentage of that, you know, to be remembered the way Dan is remembered by the whole community, you know. And I think I will try to pass on his legacy by trying to follow in his footsteps, you know, and do my best to be the figure that he was to me, to others. And you know, and it's on a small scale, but I'm trying to be there for, you know, for some of the cats at my school, you know, and I just I want to share the love of Dan Miller in everything I do, you know, and of course in everything that I play and every note that I play, but also just in the way that I carry myself, in the way that I talk to people, you know. I want to share because Dan's personality, his love and passion was like infectious, you know, like you couldn't help but be happy when you were around Dan, you know. You crack jokes and make you smile and this and that. So I hope to just pass that on by, by example, you know, and also to pass on a lot of the stuff that he taught me, you know. There's so many gold nuggets in all the lessons that we had, whether it was stories or straight up how to do this, you know, how to do that. There's just so much greatness in everything that he passed on that I hope to pass on to others after me, you know. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Um, Clark Terry is my favorite musician of all time, you know, across genre. I have a lot of favorite musicians, and this has kind of been like an uplifting thought for me in this past week, is that I've been I've been very fortunate to have met a lot of trumpet players and a lot of my heroes that had like a very close connection with Clark, you know, and they've all mentioned the same, like similar things to me about like, you know, this is me passing it on because of who Clark was for me, you know, this is me paying it forward. I wouldn't be in the position to do this for you had it not been for Clark back in the day. And, you know, it's just this feeling of like lineage, you know, from all these different people. And I feel like I'm a part of that lineage now, you know. Of course, you know, with the lineage of those people from Clark, but now like a direct connection with Dan Miller, you know. As time goes on, I get to tell people, you know, this is who Dan was and this is what he used to do, this is how he used to play, and I can share recordings. One of the things that I admired most about Dan was like a wealth of knowledge when it came to anything jazz, man. It was so interesting to see. Like if you just go through Facebook, you know, his Facebook feed and stuff like that, and somebody would ask a question about, you know, who's on this record or when was this recording, or they would say, you know, I need to check this person out in these years, you know. Dan was just he would respond with a catalog of like, all right, these are the cats on this record, this is the year, you know, and it would just be like six, seven different recordings and be like, you know, this is what you got to check out for this. Like Dan, he just knew about everything, you know. That's I that's a lifetime of knowledge right there, you know. And yeah, it's just one of those things that has been a thought that has helped me in this past week is that I feel like I'm part of that lineage now, you know, and in some little way that hopefully will help somebody in the future, I can pass on some of the stuff that Dan gave me, you know. So yeah.
Well, I can tell you that you're already well on that path, you know, and I I think that that's it, to me, what I noticed, like, from just our initial conversations and stuff, was that even though you didn't spend 20 years or 30 years, I mean, you're not even that old yet, studying with Dan, uh, there are certain people that you meet in life where there is an immediate connection, and it doesn't matter whether you're with them for 20 years or 20 months, that there's a depth, and you're so in sync that things just really are super impactful. And that's what I have observed with you. And my encouragement to you is, um, never lose sight of the fact that you had that golden opportunity. And would have been nice if it could have been longer and he'd be there for all those wonderful milestones. Yeah, but the truth of the matter is that you had those moments, and they have impacted your life so tremendously. And as you said, now you are part of this lineage, and you're put into a position where now you even have even greater power to ensure that this lineage continues. And like I said, man, you've got a heart. You got a heart and a sound like Dan. Big. So
Thank you.
now just keep cranking on those studies. Start digging into that history.
Yeah.
And always, I think this is the big lesson for all of us, is at the end of the day, I mean, everybody I've talked to, certainly we talk about how great of a player he was, but ultimately what it comes down to is how great of a person he was. And I think at the end of the day, when we all finally have to make that transition, that I think we all want to be remembered more for who we were, than what we did. And so I hope that if there's nothing else that anyone takes from this tribute that I'm putting together for Dan, I hope it's that the keys are, one, be passionate about what you do. Love life, love others, let that come through in everything that you do. And and then the other one is just don't miss an opportunity to tell someone how important they are to you.
I was very fortunate that I would, in my last conversation with Dan, and a big part of it was because we spoke about the podcast, but I was able to tell him, thank you for everything. I think that's helped me a lot. That if I would have been hurting in a different way if I had known that I wasn't able to say something one last time. I'm very lucky in that sense that I don't have any regrets about how our relationship was before he passed, or how things ended last time before he passed, because we were able to share the love, before he passed away. So I feel very fortunate for that to have been the case.
To put everything together, I spoke with the person who was closest to Dan and who knew him longer and better than anyone else, and that's his brother Dave. Dave is a world-class trombonist who shares Dan's passion for both the performing of music and teaching it to a new generation. So let's hear about how these two grew up together and how Dan was a constant inspiration.
Well, I'm Dan's brother, Dave Miller, and he was my best friend, and I mourn his passing every day, constantly. There's not a moment that goes by that I'm not ready to pick up the phone to call him about something, music related or anything. He was really my best friend, and we grew up in Illinois, northern suburbs of Chicago, right on Lake Michigan, in a town called Gurnee. When we were around 10 years old is the age when you would start band. And our father, had been a trumpet player during his formative years in high school, college, and beyond. He was a cornet soloist and eventually switched over to trumpet. Loved playing jazz, oompa music, whatever was available to play. He was very into it. Eventually, he put the trumpet away in the early to mid 1950s. So by the time it was time for us to pick up an instrument, my dad had a cornet actually for my brother, his cornet, and got it fixed and said, "This is what you're playing." And he took to it, and he would practice a lot. 2 years later, it was my turn. My dad got me a trombone. "This is what you're playing." And so we would we had band in school, some great teachers. Mr. Randy Hooverman in particular really lit the fire for us to practice and try to become better on our instruments. We grew up in a household where there was, when the parents were home, there would be a lot of music that would be played. My dad had a great record collection with Oscar Peterson, Maynard Ferguson, Count Basie, Louis Armstrong, Buddy Rich. Whenever artists of big renown would come close to where we grew up, our dad would take us. We would go into Chicago back in the days when Rick's Cafe Americana had Sunday matinees so young people could get in. And I know a real impactful moment on the both of us was, and I want to say this is early 80s, we saw Dizzy Gillespie in person at Rick's Cafe Americana. And, totally blown away. Musically, obviously, we don't know what's going on other than the pyrotechnics are spectacular.
Right.
And then just how great of an entertainer he was on top of it. And we got to meet him afterwards, and he talked to us for a long time. And that was a real pivotal moment for Dan, I know, on his musical journey. So once we get to high school, he starts to develop some serious high chops. I don't know how he did it. I don't know how I did it, but it was like we would play along with records, and if we could hear it, we would go for it. And all of a sudden, we could get it, and he could get it. And so he developed into a really outstanding trumpet player at the high school age. And we went to North Texas State. We had some great time, and where we both had the opportunity, and I followed him, by the way, to North Texas State because we had the opportunity to study with the great Don Jacoby. Jake was the best. He turned around the way I play. He turned around the way Dan played. Dan could play great, but Jake taught him a different way to think about playing. Dan also had a wonderful relationship, which started in his high school years with Bobby Shue, who was truly a defining force and a big mentor to Dan. His teachings really, it was very important what Bobby provided to Dan in knowledge of the approach to playing the instrument itself. And, one of the last things Dan did was he went out to see Bobby in early July to go meet with him, hang, take some lessons, get everything dialed back in. So those were two very important people in Dan's musical life, I would say, Bobby Shue and Don Jacoby on playing the trumpet. When it comes to improvising, probably Barry Harris would be the most important figure in his life. We moved together to New York in December of 91. Dan had been playing with Harry Connick Jr. And so we decided to move to New York to make a go at as professional musicians. And that's where we met so many. In addition to the people we've met along the way, met so many wonderful musicians. Yeah, you could throw a rock from where we lived and you could hit a Kenny Rampton, a Jim Seeley. It was just the list of a Jim Rotundi, the list of people. That's just the trumpet players. the list was endless. And so that was basically our musical journey from childhood to our early 20s when we arrived in New York.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's such a great journey. And, I think one of the things that I'm picking up from that is that the love for music was passed down through the family, and that it was a big part of your upbringing. And so it's like, it's almost like you didn't have a choice but to be a musician. Not that you're being forced to it, but it is just so much a part of who you were, growing up. And in Dan, that's the one thing I've heard from everybody is that it's like he just lived and breathed the joy of music.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
So I know siblings can be interesting. Having siblings can be interesting, and sometimes you love each other, sometimes not so much. You butt your heads every once in a while. But working, not just having a sibling who's a musician, but working with him, in different projects, living with him. How did you influence each other?
Oh, he's the deepest influence in my life on me, period. Why aren't you practicing? What are you doing? Turn off the TV. Get your horn up. Let's go. Let's play. I know you mentioned that that some siblings don't have great relationships and they're rocky patches and things of that nature. I'm going to be perfectly honest here. I had 2 arguments with my brother, fights with my brother in our entire lives. And I'm 52 and he was 54 when he passed. We loved each other. And he was a massive influence on me. How would I say this? I knew that he knew what was best for me. And when he would say something or recommend something or ask me to do something, I knew that there was a reason behind it and the reason was solid. And it wasn't like I was getting advice from somebody who didn't know what they were talking about. Be it life lessons, how to be a good person. I mean, our parents raised us to follow the golden rule and things, but be it life lessons, lessons on professionalism not just as a musician, but professionalism. I knew that his brass thing, come on, we've heard him play. I knew that any advice he would give me there. And to be honest, there wasn't a lot of advice there because we had both studied with Jake, with Don Jacoby, and, that was the system. The way that Jake taught, we kind of played the same way in that aspect. But improvising, when we first moved to New York and started going to the Barry Harris, it turned our minds around on ways to think about how to play and coming up with a systematic approach for improvising to try to create beautiful melodies. And so I knew he always had my best interests at heart.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's the thing is that when something when you know that something is coming from a place of love, then it's so much easier to accept, when you're being challenged or when you're giving guidance or things like that. It's knowing that it is truly coming from a place that someone really wants the absolute best for you.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm.
I mean, and that seems to be that, obviously, your brothers, you're close. We would accept that as being, okay, I can take that. I can understand that. But from everyone that I've talked to about Dan, everybody that knows Dan, they said that was the way that he treated everybody.
It was.
That it was always just, hey, this is what I think, but it's not being judgmental. It's just like, hey, this is my experience and this is what I think is the best for you. And I just want you to have the best life that you can have.
Yep. One of the things that did not occur to me, because he's my brother, and I just think of him as my brother, I just think of him as Dan, was like the profound effect that he had on so many people, not just as a musician or musically, but on a personal level. You know, everyone. I mean, I've heard, the family has heard from so many people from across the years, just expressing their condolences and their warmest wishes on Dan. Everybody loved him. Everybody who met him loved him, you know, because he treated people the way that people like to be treated, you know, with respect and dignity. And of course, a lot of laughs too. You know, that's part of the equation too. And it's really a wonderful legacy that he leaves behind when it comes to that, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it was Kenny who, when I was talking to Kenny Rampton, he said that Dan was, he was passionate. Everything that Dan was in, he was passionate about, whether it be music or sports or movies or anything. And he had almost like an encyclopedic knowledge of these things. So, you know, in terms of like how you two interacted with each other growing up, did you have that same kind of drive for the deep knowledge and the background?
Yes.
Stuff?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Like he said, it was not just music. It was sports. It was auto racing. It was whatever we were involved in. We would go 100%. Absolutely. You know, every record album, liner notes would have to be read. You know, how else are you going to learn the history? You know, the books, constant. When I was packing up the house, I can't tell you the amount of books that we had in the house, in the storage unit here. We would dive pretty deep into whatever we were doing, very deep. I know he wrote, and this was not something that either one of us view as work. It's what we like to do. So when, for example, he wants to really dig into Booker Little, you know, he's searching after source material, recordings, air shots, everything he can get his hands on, what's been written about him. You know, that way you can do a deep dive into what goes into the behind the artistry. You know, so he can then, you know, synthesize it and write articles or whatever to further spread the gospel, if you will.
Yeah. So do you share Dan's passion for education as well?
Absolutely. Yes. I'm up here in lovely New Jersey. I teach in the public schools. I teach beginning band to fifth graders. I start them out on all their instruments. I also teach privately here at the house. And for the past right around 3 years, I've been working down at Princeton University teaching jazz trombone to students who are interested in playing. And a few years ago, I used to work at Rutgers leading a youth jazz ensemble. And I know it was so important to Dan is that when you can expose the kids and students, and, you know, he had students for a wide variety of ages. The more you can expose students to this music and to learn how to express themselves creatively, the better they become as people too, not just musicians. And that was one of the things a lot of Dan's students, when I was down in Florida the past 3 weeks, had expressed to me. Not just, well, he taught me how to do this, he taught me how to do that. You know, he taught me how to be a good person. He was my first real role model on what an adult man should act like and how they should comport themselves in all situations. And, you know, I think that's a very important part of his legacy. To me, that was very important when I heard it and that was from multiple people.
And that is so important. I think that, you know, the music is great, you know, being a fellow musician. Yes. You know, I love it. I love the legacy. I love the history of jazz. I love what all music brings to the table, but ultimately it's a tool for expression of, you know, who we are as a people, as a race, as a society. And I think that people like Dan are exceptionally rare in that they grasp the importance of this as being a vehicle of being a better, of expressing who you are. And if you want to make your music better, then you need to become a better person. And everyone I talk to, the students and things like that, that's what they feel, is that he exemplified that melding of tremendous talent and tremendous character, and the giving nature and the loving nature. Like I said before, I never met Dan, but I felt like I knew him.
Mm-hmm.
Through people that I've talked to, and through listening to his music. And you could hear his passion come through the horn. And that's the sort of thing I aspire to, is to make the expression of music to be a pure expression of who I am as a person. So you've used the term legacy a lot, and that's actually a question that I ask all of my guests on my show, and particularly I've been doing this about this episode for Dan, is about legacy. And what do you see the major impact of the legacy that Dan has left for us all, and what can we do to ensure that legacy continues forward?
I was giving this some thought because you had mentioned this, and I'm so close to it. I always viewed him as my brother. He was Dan. I didn't view him as this magnificent lead player or this astounding improviser. I mean, I knew, but that was not how I saw him as my brother Dan, who I loved tremendously. When it comes to his legacy, he touched the lives of so many people. So many people, be it students, friends, fellow musicians, fans, music lovers. He will not be forgotten for the joy that he has brought to so many people's lives, and the happiness that's due to him being the person that he was. I think that seems like a fair statement.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you meet someone, when you have someone in your life that has that level of, I don't know how to put it, if that purity of spirit, right? Not. And when I say purity, I mean not meaning didn't make mistakes.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah.
But Dan, from all accounts, Dan was always Dan. He didn't put on a front. He was a genuine, pure expression of who he was, and that is that's a hard task to be that way sometimes in this world, and especially in the music world.
Mm-hmm.
But, as you look out, and the impact he's had on you, and the impact he's had on people like me or students or whatever. I mean, if there's just one thing that you could point to and say, hey, this could be the greatest tribute to Dan if you were to do this thing or to approach life in this way. What would you say?
Wow. One of the things that our dad taught us was that if you put your mind to a task at hand and give 100% effort, you can achieve what you seek. One thing that and Dan believed that intently, tremendously, that if you put your mind to a task at hand, if you work hard enough, if you put in the time, you can make these things happen. So I guess the one thing that Okay, the legacy of Dan Miller is as follows. If you're going to do something, you want to do something, you want to achieve something, you have to go all out. Don't have a plan B. You have to go all out to make your situation that you would like to see. You have control. There are outside forces, but you have control over it through your efforts. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, is there any like kind of closing thought that you'd like to share with people? How would you like people to remember your brother?
I would like people to remember my brother for the joy that they brought with the joy that he brought to their lives. We had so many laughs together over the years. I mean, nonstop. And I think everybody you talked to, beyond the level of musicianship and how great it was to play with him and work with him, he was just so warm and so funny. I can't tell you how many laughs we had together. And I mean, not just like chuckles. I mean, belly laughs, laughing so hard I can't catch my breath, starting to cry. He always had the funniest thing to say at the perfect moment. And I hope everyone can remember the joy that he brought to your lives. Again, either through music or just through Dan being Dan.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think at the end of the day, that's what we all should kind of aspire to, is just bringing joy to other people's lives and whatever we do, whether you're a musician or a carpenter or whatever, everyone we meet, we have an opportunity to make their lives a little better. And it's obvious that Dan has influenced you in so many different ways. And I know that he will sorely be missed. And, but I know that his memory is also going to, fill you with love and joy and encouragement. And he's never going to be truly gone, because he's going to be with us in our hearts and our minds forever.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, he will be.
Well, that wraps it up for this special episode. I want to thank all of my guests for sharing their thoughts during such a difficult time. My hope is that this episode helps to keep Dan's legacy alive, and that you feel inspired to live life to its fullest, and also feel compelled to inspire others through your actions. And I'd also like to ask that you consider helping our next generation of jazz musicians by contributing to the Dan Miller Jazz Master Memorial Scholarship Fund. Now, the scholarship fund is being created to help aspiring young musicians that are in financial aid. So keep an eye on Dan's website for updates on this project, and the links are in the show notes. So, in honor of Dan, keep on swinging. Thanks for hanging with us today. This podcast is all about creating deeper connections through our mutual love of music and the trumpet life. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast, and also like and share this episode with a friend. We want to see the hang grow for show. Please support our sponsors, and consider becoming a personal supporter of this podcast as well. Remember, for less than the price of a bottle of valve oil a month, you can keep this podcast moving smoothly. The Trumpet Gurus Hang is recorded at the Candy Factory, a co-working space and social club located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Jose Johnson is the executive producer. Post-production editing is by Mitch Bowers. Our opening theme song was composed and performed by Lexi Signal, and our closing theme music comes courtesy of The Greatest Funeral Ever. Incidental music is by Ethan Swayze and Jose Johnson. Graphic design by Ann Kirby of the Sweet Corps. The Trumpet Gurus Hang podcast is produced in collaboration with the So Good Lancaster Media Group.